Let's stay with all things Chinese. Fronteir Advisories hosting the China-Africa Business Forum in Joburg yesterday, bringing together leading decision makers from Chinese and African companies. It notes that China's engagement of Africa has been the leading megatrend over the last decade. China is now the single largest trading partner for Africa, the largest financier of infrastructure, and the largest lender to African governments. To discuss, we're joined by the CEO of Fronteir Advisories, Martyn Davies. Great to have you with us.
Good evening,
Martyn.
Francis. Thank you.
We have to talk about Alibaba first. Do you think it's a lot of hype, or is this something amazing happening?
It's staggering. I saw your chart of the largest IPOs ever, and of those 5 companies, 3 are American and 2 are Chinese. It's about scale, and it's no longer the Chinese story with stereotypically Chinese state-owned companies. This is about Chinese innovation, Chinese high-tech. We see it of Tencent, which Naspers owns a sizable share of. And now we see it of Alibaba. The rise of e-commerce, the rise of middle-class consumer spending is indeed staggering. And when you have the likes of Alibaba, this is a company almost 20 years old. I met Jack Ma, by the way, the founder.
What's he like?
Look, he's a dynamic individual. He's a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. We met in I think it was Dalian about a year ago, with a whole group of people, and the guy's deeply impressive. But it's the Chinese dream. It's the Chinese entrepreneurial dream.
Well, it's actually the American dream that's become Chinese.
Well, the Chinese are rapidly replicating it. People see China in obsolete state sort of enterprise terms, but the real story of China is exactly this. A guy who starts an English, he's English teacher, and next thing you know, he's raised, I believe he's worth $13 billion as of today. It's an incredible story, and we've seen that across China. It's not money made through political patronage, it's money made through entrepreneurship and innovation, and that's impressive.
Okay, let's talk about China in Africa now, because you say that the engagement of China is reshaping Africa's economic landscape. How?
Well, what we've seen in the last decade and a half, when China sort of re-energized its foreign commercial policy toward the continent, no longer on sort of obsolete ideological political terms, but now purely geoeconomic, geopolitical, and commercial. So you mentioned, yes, China's the single largest trading partner of the continent since 2008. China's the largest financier of infrastructure. So we've seen a lot of state capital coming in, state-owned enterprises, infrastructure, mining, oil, extractive industries, and it really has. China's really started to, if it wasn't for China, would we be seeing the interest in Africa from other traditional partners or players as we are today? I think the second thing is that China's been somewhat disruptive from state capital. It's also been disruptive by the commodity supercycle. China's growth model in the last 2.5 decades has been averaging roughly 10% per year, incredibly resource-intensive growth model. This has been very good for Africa, considering the resource of commodities underpinning most of our economies. So it's this alignment of interests.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the problems with that. I mean, there was this fear about economic colonialism and that all our commodities would go to China. We would again be buying back things at a bigger price. We're now talking about beneficiation, and our president has also spoken about keeping those trade ties even and beneficial for both. Is that an old argument? Are we now already there?
I think it's a simplistic argument. I think, of course, China's your biggest customer of your single largest product. So what's the problem? That's been very positive for underpinning African growth, as mentioned. The challenge is, how is African economies, not just Africa, but Latin America, Southeast Asia, maybe emerging Europe, how have these economies been able to compete at the China price? So yes, we are exporting non-beneficiated largely commodities to China, to Asia, where it's manufactured value add, and we're importing the finished products at a much higher price thereafter. Do we blame China for being too competitive, or do we look at ourselves? I'd say certainly the latter, where Southeast Asian economies have been able to reposition and flourish in the rise of this China manufacturing machine, which accounts for about 20% roughly of global manufacturing value add currently. The challenges for African economies is, how do you industrialize in the face of such intense competition the last decade and a half or so?
Let's talk about the infrastructure as well, because a lot of Chinese firms, one in particular, involved with Transnet now. So they will be coming, but they are coming here, building here, upskilling here as well. Is that the kind of engagement we want? Because you're also talking about a lot of finance for infrastructure, but that's kind of an arm's length relationship.
China's advantage has been sort of low-cost engineering, package deals, market penetrating in numbers. So the capital, the finance would come with the infrastructure player, with the supply chain, etc. So we've seen that I think that story is coming to an end, to be honest. I think we've seen this rapid market entry of Chinese companies, not so much in South Africa, but the region, as this package deal. I think in South Africa's case, there was a infrastructure investment conference hosted by the German government, the German Chamber Deutsche Messe, on Tuesday and Wednesday on the sidelines of electromining at Nasrec. And this was discussed. So you had traditional interests, traditional European companies, US companies, infrastructure in Africa, and how do they compete against this Chinese package deal in infrastructure? It's been very difficult, but I think that story is starting to come to an end from the Chinese side, and we see it in South Africa. I think the traditional players, the traditional actors, the European firms are able to I think increasingly will maintain or build their presence on the ground, engineering in infrastructure in Africa. The Chinese competitiveness will remain in certain economies, but certainly not pervasively across Africa.
Finally, let's talk about yesterday, because you were there. We had Chinese companies, South African companies, and how do small private companies benefit? Because do you have these barriers? It takes years and years to learn Mandarin. Maybe you get translators, but is there that sort of ground level engagement starting to build up?
Majority of South African small companies, or African small companies for that matter, it's a trading story. So purchasing from China, selling in Africa, which is not ideal. We have a small number, maybe a dozen and a half, perhaps, South African companies, sizable ones, that have a presence in China. So obviously mining companies, Holland Insurance, Discovery, SABC Miller is the largest brewer of beer in China, Naspers is mentioned, a few others. It's very difficult for small enterprise from South Africa to penetrate such a very, very competitive market that is China. We saw companies like Spur go into China, move out of China. There's been a lot of successes, notable ones. There's also a lot of failures as well. It's a very highly competitive market, and the resources a company needs, and as you allude to, the sort of network, the networks, the cultural knowledge perhaps, to navigate and succeed in China, by no means is it easy.
Take years. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'm so intrigued that you've actually met Jack Ma. You can give him our compliments. That was Martyn Davies, CEO of Fronteir Advisories. Well, world markets were buoyed by strong demand for that Alibaba IPO today. In its debut, the shares already have risen as much as 46%. That news just in. That's on the first day of trading, and that lifts the Chinese online retailer's value to $244 billion. So we have seen that jump as expected. The referendum in Scotland, where Scots voted no to independence, also calming world markets today. The JSE, however, ended the week a tad in the red. Let's take a look at your main financial indicators.